the absolute flip side of transparency is trust, right? Like, how do you truly build trust? It's through transparency. We've seen that time and time and again in like almost all societal processes that we try to, like, you got to have that transparency. And I think so much of growth, right? And I talk about kind of growth in a very strict sense, like revenue growth, like whatever metrics growth for a startup is inversely proportional to the friction of adopting that product. And trust, I think, is one of the smartest way that you can reduce friction in the adoption product.
Welcome back to the Eric Ries Show. Today's conversation is not your typical Silicon Valley origin story. Emil is the CEO and founder of Neo4j, an open source graph database. He took a path shaped by a different context, one grounded in Sweden, but built with a vision for the global stage. In today's conversation, we explore how his team turned an early open source graph database into a tool that powers some of the largest organizations in the world, all while navigating the thorny issues of trust, transparency, and mission-driven growth. This is a story of relentless iteration, on betting big on ideas that seem impossible until they aren't, of embracing values that evolve with time but never drift from their core. This is how founders can build a company that endures, adapts, and still holds true to its mission in the face of change. I'm a big believer in the open source movement. I was a FSF licensing volunteer, for those who know what that was. And it's really thrilling to me to see someone like Emil take the open source ethos and build a tremendous business on top of it. Here's my conversation with Emil Eifrem. So Emil, thank you for coming on the show. It's great to see you as always.
Fantastic. Great to be here.
Okay, so I remember the first time we met, I have a vivid memory of being on the streets of San Francisco, and you were telling me about this open source graph database, and you were trying to convince me that I should come to visit you in Malmo, Sweden. And I
where
did.
I am right now, actually.
Where you are right now. And I did, and I had a tremendously great, I learned a lot on that trip, actually. It was super interesting. This is far before the publication of the Lean Startup. This is quite a number of years ago. And I thought maybe we just start, maybe tell the story of like, how did you come all the way from Sweden? How did you come to be in San Francisco? And why were we meeting? Like, how did that come to be? And then, how did you wind up back in Malmo, Sweden after all that? Like, give us a bit of that story.
Yeah, so we can go into the kind of the founding story of Neo4j, at some point. But I started Neo4j together with my two co-founders. We were building this new type of database, and we were based in Sweden. But we always felt like this was a very Silicon Valley-esque company. This is kind of late 2000s, so way back when dinosaurs ruled the earth, and it was harder to build completely remote companies back then. Right. And I always had this kind of idea around there are centers of gravity for every industry, right? Like if you want to build like a new fashion company, you should probably be in kind of Paris or Milan, or like, I have no idea about fashion actually, but I think that's true, right? And finance is probably like whatever, New York, London, maybe Tokyo.
Silicon Valley, we're a company town for innovation. Absolutely.
Totally, right? In tech, and especially like database. Are you kidding me? Like at the time, there'd been no new successful database companies for about 3-4 decades, right? So I felt like Silicon Valley was kind of the go-to town for us, right? And so I was traveling there a lot. Hadn't moved there yet, but I was traveling there a lot, talked to a bunch of VCs. Embarrassingly enough, I don't actually recall. I think it was someone at Menlo Ventures who mentioned, there's this guy that I know that you really should kind of talk to. I looked up your blog, and you just published the Hello, My Lonely 5 Subscribers blog post, which was like, I don't know, your second or third or fourth blog.
It was very early. Yes. We'll link to it for those that want that piece of history. Yeah. Hello, my 5 subscribers. Who are you?
Yeah. Something like that. Right. Yeah. But I was just captivated by the content. I'm like, okay, this is really, really new and novel and groundbreaking. And as a technologist, I'd seen kind of whatever Agile and Scrum and Lean and like all that on the, I don't know, call it the production side of the house. But I was also just even learning, like, how do I even build a product that is not just for me, but like that others can appreciate? And this just gave me a mental model, a framework for how to navigate that. And the closest that had seen at that time was like the 4 Steps book, right? Which Actually, not. Actually, I think you must have referred me to it. Actually, so probably hadn't even seen that when I read the blog. And so anyway, so I think I just cold emailed you, or maybe we got connected that way. And one thing led to the other, and I'm like, all right, I got to bring this dude to Europe. Like, this is too good to not be shared, outside of Silicon Valley. So I think that's how it started.
This episode is brought to you by Vanta. If you're a startup founder, then product market fit is obviously your number one priority. But to land bigger customers, you also need security compliance. And obtaining your SOC 2 or ISO 27001 certification can open those big doors. But they take time and energy, pulling you away from building and shipping. That's where Vanta comes in. Vanta is the all-in-one compliance solution helping startups get audit ready and build a strong security foundation quickly and painlessly. Through the platform, access trusted experts to build your program, auditors to get you through audits quickly, and a marketplace for essentials like pen testing. So, whether you're closing your first deal or gearing up for growth, Vanta makes compliance easy. Join over 8,000 companies, including many Y Combinator and Techstar startups who trust Vanta. Simplify compliance and get $1,000 off at vanta.com/Eric. That's VANTA.com/Eric. This episode is brought to you by Gusto. I'm a huge fan of Gusto. I've used the product myself across many companies, many startups, large, small business, venture-backed, you name it. I've used Gusto for payroll, for benefits, for employee onboarding, HR, even small group health insurance for nearly any budget. Best of all, Gusto pays all your federal, state, and local payroll taxes in all 50 states. It turns an incredibly time-consuming and painful process into the click of a button. That's why I like Gusto. Oh, and if you're listening to this, you can get 3 months free at gusto.com/Eric. That's gusto.com/ERIC. I have very fond memories of those days, and I appreciate that you were such an early evangelist of the ideas, and you got so many people excited about it. And also, this is one of those like very early companies that I was really excited about. I was like, oh, this could really be helpful to a whole new generation of entrepreneurs who are not just doing the same old thing. I thought your story was really, really different. So tell us a little bit about it, because this is, again, not your typical Silicon Valley origin story of, whatever, kids in their Ivy League garage doing whatever. You guys had been building this database in a totally different context in Sweden. I remember very vividly that I was so excited about it because I've been pitched a lot of database startups. Even back then, it was not that uncommon for people to say they wanted to do this, but very few of them ever even got deployed, let alone got to a level of production quality that people could use them for real. And here was such a different story. Had this open source component, which I loved. I was a big advocate for that. Had this production history of being useful, and yet was something totally different than we had seen in the database. I mean, I think maybe at that time, am I right, that Facebook either had only just started using social graph language, or maybe hadn't even really publicized, like graph theory and graph database were not something that were widely known. Graph data structures were not super popular among technologists. So it was something very different, and yet it had all this history to it. Yeah, tell listeners about kind of what brought you to that point, and then we'll carry the story forward.
Yeah, so maybe two distinct things in there. One is kind of the name, which has its own entire kind of story and a ton of mistakes and kind of scars and but also lots of good learnings and reasonable success in there. But in terms of the actual kind of innovation in the technology and all of that, so I'm born and raised in Sweden, which is now where I'm after just short of a decade in the Valley. This is where I'm now back, and I ended up joining a startup because I was in the military. Which is because we had mandatory conscription at the time in Sweden. I actually didn't do a military service. It's like a civil service. I refused to carry a weapon, which is a different thing, which we can tie back to all kinds of stuff about selling into the military and stuff like that later, if you want to. But and so I had like a gap of 9 months or so. I got out of the military at in October, November. And so I was gonna I gotten accepted to a good local school here in Sweden, and was going to study computer science, was very gung-ho with that, but realized I got October, November, I was going to miss the first couple of months, which is where there's at engineering schools in Sweden, the first couple of months it's 8 hours of math and 12 hours of drinking. And I'm like, I'm not going to miss that part, right? And so I was kind of looking around, and I was, I'd been programming for half my life at the time, right? And there's like this local company, small company that they were hiring for just like 6-9 months, like perfect, right? Except they didn't call themselves like a small company. They used like a very weird term that I never used before. They called themselves a startup, right? Like they're so different. They had investors and this and that, and like, but you're just a small company. No, you don't get it. It's much different. So I joined that company. We were building enterprise content management systems, right? So hey, I have tons of big files. I want to upload them somewhere, like not store them in my local file server. And I was whatever 20 years old, didn't know what I was doing at all, but pretty rapidly became the CTO of the company and had like 20 people like working for me. And what we saw was that like half of them spent the majority of their time fighting against the database. And this was like very like unlike all my previous experiences, where the database took like this big, gnarly, hairy problem of storing stuff on disk, ensuring that it's there and queryable, and transactions and concurrency and like all kinds of big, gnarly problems. Took that off my table, no pun intended, so I could focus on building the application, right? But that wasn't true in this case. I think today, 20 years later, as an industry, we have a very clear understanding of what actually happened, right? Which is there's a mismatch between the shape of the data and the core abstractions exposed by the database. So in other words, we had messy, connected, like highly complex data that we tried to squeeze into this square and static data model, right? But we didn't have that understanding back then. So we just kind of banged our heads against the proverbial relational wall for quite some time until finally we just said, all right, something is wrong here. Like there's got to be a better way of structuring this data. And we realized many of the problems that we had, if only we could think of the data in terms of networks, right? Like nodes connected to other nodes through relationships. Hallelujah, that solved like actually all these problems, right? And we were, young enough and naive enough to say that, we started kind of looking around for this, and couldn't find anything, right? But at some point we just said, come on, like, let's just build it. Quote, how hard can it be? Right?
Famous last words. Yeah.
Famous last words. It turns out it was pretty hard. But so anyway, so we built that out, put it in production at this small startup, which went through the IT crash. So it actually went bankrupt, and we had to like buy the assets, rebuild the application, but on top of this new thing, notice that we could build it so much faster, not just because we'd done it once before, but because we had this flexible data structure that we built it on that was a much more kind of better fit for purpose for that application. And that's when we started getting really enthusiastic. And that ultimately led to us saying, you know what, let's try to like wrap a company around this idea, not just kind of the old startup. So that is kind of the origin story. And I went to school in parallel and like all kinds of life stuff, but that's kind of ultimately what led to me, cold emailing some dude called Eric Ries, way back in the late 2000s.
Why did you decide to open source it?
So there's several drivers for that. One was we always felt that we were kind of temporarily a smaller company than Oracle, which meant that our marketing budget was, between $4 and $5 in units of one. And like this ultimately had to be a developer-led phenomena, right? And this was kind of early days for that, but you could already very much feel kind of the pendulum swing away from kind of central IT, kind of top-down decision-making on this particular tools, and kind of the value of engineers, right, was really kind of starting to start, like the perceived value of that inside of these organizations, which started swinging the decision-making power, not necessarily kind of budget authority and stuff like that, but certainly in choices of tools towards the developer, right? So we felt that that was like a really kind of, not just a smart, like the only way we could think of getting this out there kind of at scale. So that was kind of one perspective. Then the other perspective was, it just felt like a much healthier and better way of building like a good company. You and I both grew up in kind of the games industry, although only one of us wrote a book called The Black Art of Game Development, or whatever it was called back in the days.
Now that's a deep cut. That's a deep cut.
That is a deep cut. And I kind of tend to simplify it. This is like way simplified, right? If you look around in the world, like there's a bunch of people walking around, instead of like having like a health meter on top of them, like in video games, I think of a happiness-o-meter.
Mm-hmm.
And then I take just a very utilitarian point of view of that. Like, if you imagine all the people interacting with my company, right, kind of directly or indirectly. So the product is, of course, maybe the biggest surface area, but all the individuals as well, right? If you add up, when I go to bed every day, if I add up all of those interactions, is the overall happiness-o-meter kind of net positive or net negative, right? And we've all worked at, well, many have worked at like big companies where they've used enterprise software that is just terrible. It's just like a completely shitty user experience, right? And why is that? Well, typically because it was sold into the CIO with like amazing PowerPoint slides, right? And this great integration story, and, you know, Deloitte and EY, you know, we make a lot of money in consulting, implementing it, and like all of that kind of stuff, right? And then, so it made a ton of sense to the CIO, and then the CIO kind of pushes it down into the org. And then it sits there with like the practitioners who use it on a day-to-day basis, which certainly, or most likely, was not part of the evaluation criteria for the CIO. But the people who use it 8 to 5 might be 10 people or 100 or like 1,000 people, right? And if you think of the happiness-o-meter impact of that, right? Like well, big happiness, I'm sure, for the CIO, lots of negative happiness-o-meter for the day-to-day people using it, right? Now, of course, if you build a product that is sold top-down, you can have a great user experience for the people who actually use the product, right? That can, of course, happen. But when you go in bottom-up, when you sell into practitioners, it's existential. You have to. You're not going to get there unless those people truly love your product, right? And so I added all those things up together. And when we sat down kind of as an early team, it was very obvious which type of company that we wanted to build.
I appreciate you start framing the discussion in terms of what type of company. I think that's really right, because there's something about open source. Open source challenges a lot of our business best practices, so-called, that people got taught. And I've been an open source advocate for a long time. You know, I used to be a FSF licensing volunteer. For those who ask me your AGPL questions anytime.
That's right.
My pleasure. So I spent a lot of time trying to convince people in conventional businesses that they should do open source. And what's really fascinating about it is it was actually really difficult to explain and convince. I didn't win many of those arguments because people would be like, wait a minute, I'm going to give away my software for free. And it's going to so that seems like it's going to be worse. Now I'm going to have, now I have less control, and I have to deal with all these annoying community people. And on top of that, I'd be like, no, but yes, it's both the right thing to do, and you'll be more trustworthy, and it will have these strategic benefits and they'd be like, yeah, but what about, can I just not do all that? I got all those benefits. I can just get them with like good marketing campaign. I get it a different way where I'm still completely in control. And I used to just be like, I didn't have a way to explain what was wrong about that. And then what's funny, I didn't realize this at the time. I only realize it at retrospect. Later on in the process of building the company or whatever the thing was, we'd run into a problem where our inauthenticity and lack of trust with our actual customers became a problem. Like, oh, we're not actually being effective in selling into the enterprise. Like, people don't want to buy our product, or they want to try it before they buy it. They don't really believe the things that we're saying. Our marketing comes across as too good to be true. And I didn't have the wherewithal to be like, see, guys, if we'd invested in being more trustworthy at the beginning, if we'd been more honest and authentic from the very start, if we were that kind of company, we wouldn't be having these problems now. Of course, by the time you make that wrong choice, now it's like, it's the customer's fault. People are out to get us. People will be on paranoid. Like, it festers and it just gets worse and more exploitative and terrible. And I was like, wow, there's something about open source that just, it's like a lightning rod. people who have this like intuitive understanding that there's like a way to build a company. And I love your image of the health meter, happiness meter, and everybody. I talk about maximizing human flourishing. That's really what we're trying to do. That's what it really means to make a profit. So talk about like, and people who've done that successfully, you know, they never, if you ever offer them the chance to switch, it's like, you've done this thing, you're highly trusted with this huge community. Would you trade it for, you know, would you like to be one of these other companies? Nobody ever wants to switch. So talk about, and yet most people have never worked at a company like yours. Most people have never made the kind of decisions you're talking about. Talk about like, what have been the maybe counterintuitive or surprising benefits to you? Both the benefits like for your employees and like for the morale of the company and the feeling that you're on a mission that really matters to people. And frankly, the strategic benefits, like, has it been net positive for the business to have made those choices?
Yeah. I mean, I think a couple of things. One is, and with someone who I actually didn't know that you were part like FSF-licensing and responded to that kind of stuff, right? You and I could start geeking out on open source licensing. So let's not do that. Let's do that like offline at some point, right? Because that is so,
no one will die of boredom.
That is so boring to everyone else, right? But just suffice to say that there's a ton of nuances and variations inside of the very, very broad term of open source. And we have not even got into the thing about with open source and AI and kind of what that all means, right? But we made a very clear decision early on that open source for us was it was a distribution mechanism, right? It was not a means of production. And this ends up being a big fork in the road when you go and you do open source, right? Because if you do it because you believe there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands of hackers out there, like good, whatever, you know, developers out there building your product for you, most people have ended up being disappointed by that. And if you do it that way, and you also really want to monetize, there are very few who have been successful with that. We had the clarity, and I'm very happy to talk about all the stuff where we didn't have clarity and stuff like that. But on this one, because I grew up in open source, we had a lot of a clarity that, no, this is a means of distribution, right? And so success for us was getting people to adopt it and spread the word. And then we didn't expect to find people out there who wrote a database kernel for us. We said, if we do our job right, growing the business, we're going to be able to hire all of those people anyway. There's like, I don't know, 1,000 amazing database kernel developers in the world anyway, right? And we should be able to hire like many of them, right? If we do our things right. We loved, however, contributions of the periphery. So in the very early days, it took not that long time until choose your favorite framework, right? It was things like Spring at the time and PHP this and that and whatever.
We're dating ourselves more and more with this conversation.
More and more. Hey, the black art of Java game programming, that is truly dating us, actually. But choose your favorite programming language, framework, whatever your stack, and there is always some kind of connectivity, a driver or an integration, like for Neo4j, and that was massive for us. So that I would say kind of is one thing. I think another one is that, this is kind of becomes weird with the pandemic, but up until like just before the pandemic kicked in, there were, for several years in a row, there were 500 plus events worldwide about Neo4j, right? Per year, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like 2 per working day, right? And our involvement was probably maybe 50 to 75 of them, right? We were kind of a small company, right? And so this was like a meetup in Jakarta, because we had this girl in Jakarta who like just loved what we did. Whenever we published like a new release or a new case study, she threw a meetup and she talked about it. And a guy in Tokyo did the same. And like maybe we bought beer and pizza kind of for that, but that was it, right? And that kind of distribution is, you can think of it as, if you asked about kind of the business and strategic benefits, like that's on some level is kind of proportional to demand gen and future growth in terms of ARR revenue, that kind of stuff. It's also moat against the competition, right? Because over time you become the default by virtue of skill set, like in your category. And it really helps with that category creation piece too, which we can put a pin in and come back to later. So those would be some of the things that I would call out.
Did you ever have a moment where you regretted it? Like just a 1 minute where you're like, oh man, this has become such a pain. I don't want to do it
Open
again.
sourcing?
Yeah.
No. There are other regrets, but no. And I think the reason why is that we chose a very, and I'll say this in very precise language, a very Swedish way of open sourcing, which is kind of the Swedish way, is kind of the middle way, right? Like we're, trying to that kind of thing, right? And this is again, like if we'd chosen like, hey, means of production, and again, not to license geek too much, it probably would have mean like an Apache license or what's called a permissive license, right? Like maybe BSD or something like that, right? And that meant that other competitors also could have picked us up, right? And I talked about a fork in the road before. Like there's another big fork in the road that happened kind of mid 2010s, right, for open source companies when the cloud platforms started entering into their category.
Yeah.
And if you have category creation, like a big vendor coming in, it is actually really positive. You know how old CEOs, whenever like a big company comes in, like, this is great validation for our market, is kind of what everyone says. Well, that actually is true when you do category creation, right? Mm-hmm. But if they enter into your category with your own product, you're
having stolen it from you, that's different. Yeah.
Oh man, that is just terrible, right? And as a consequence of some of the licensing decisions that we made, we precluded that from happening. So
I remember having that conversation like 10 years earlier, to make sure that it was done properly. Yeah. The little details matter a lot. And people throw around these big terms like open source, and it's like, you do have to get the details right. Pitch me on doing it. Like imagine I'm a founder right now. I'm building some SaaS, something technical product. And I'm sitting there and I've got investors being like, oh, I don't know, people might not like it if you open source it or whatever. And I got maybe some engineers who are like, no, this is the right thing to do. Our name will live forever. Like it's a path to immortality. It'll have all these benefits. I heard Neo4j is doing really great. Like I'm like, oh, I'm not sure. Why should I do it?
Yeah, so I would have to go to a consultant answer of it. Depends, depends.
Well, what does it depend on then?
Yeah, so I think the gating factor for me is the developer like a very important decision maker in the adoption process for that product. Mm-hmm. If that ends up being true, open source, I think generally, like we're generalizing here, but generally ends up being very net positive, right? You used the word, I don't know if that was intentional, but like you used the word trust before, right? Mm-hmm. And that's such a huge part of it. I think like the absolute flip side of transparency is trust, mm-hmm. right? Like how do you truly build trust? It's through transparency. We've seen that time and time and again in like almost all societal processes that we try to, like, you got to have that transparency. And when it comes to like developer tooling, like open source is the most transparent thing that we've been able to invent as an industry, which leads to the trust that is one of those friction reducers, right, in the adoption process. And I think so much of growth, right, and I talk about kind of growth in a very strict sense, like revenue growth, like whatever metrics growth for a startup is inversely proportional to the friction of adopting that product. And trust, I think, is one of the smartest way that you can reduce friction in the adoption product. So that would be kind of the core of my pitch. Probably not as eloquently and punchy like as I would have said 10, 15 years ago when I was thinking it through myself, but that would be kind of the core of the argument of why I believe that's the right thing to do for those types of products.
Yeah, I like that metaphor of trust as like a friction lubrication, like just a friction reducer, right? That's such an important part of starting something new, is just to get people to try it, to adopt it, to build on it, to evangelize it. If they don't trust you, it's not possible. And this has actually been one of the most common recurring topics that's come up in these conversations, talking to people who've built, so many multi-billion-dollar companies and done such incredible things, that today our kind of normalized business practice does not treat trust and trustworthiness as an asset on the balance sheet. And so we tend to underappreciate techniques and, strategies and, commitments and values that build trust. And then we regret it later, and then we deal with the consequences, and everything seems so much more difficult. I work with a lot of people who like trying to get them to do something more trustworthy, including like open sourcing their product. People say to me like, "Oh man, business is already so hard."
Right.
You're asking me to do something even more hard. Like, gosh, I don't know. Like, the only people that complain to me about business being so hard are people who are working in low trust environments. People who like really have it, like when the alignment is there and you're in that flow state, people don't complain about that. And I always ask to answer the same way. Look, maybe the reason business is so hard for you is nobody trusts you. Maybe if you did the right thing a little more often, then you wouldn't find it so difficult. You'd have the energy and the stamina to do the next right thing, and it would build on itself. So talk about how that's evolved for you. Like,
sorry, can I just tee off your trust thing?
Yeah, please.
Kind of an anecdote. This actually became. I love what you said. I actually do think that there are plenty of situations where business can be hard, even in a high trust environment.
Sure.
So I'm gonna disagree on that part. But I love all that, which is, and I guess what it triggered in my mind that one of the things as an entrepreneur who kind of grew up in Sweden, ran a company in Sweden, then moved to the US and ran a company over there. Sometimes, in particular in the early days, I got asked questions or asked to give talks around kind of the difference running it kind of in Europe or in Scandinavia or in Sweden versus in the US. And one of the things that surprised me the most with the shift over to the Valley and to the US, which was the second time that I lived in the US, but the first time was as a teenager going to high school, right? Mm-hmm. So this was the first time running a business. It became very clear to me that the US on a relative basis is a lower trust society compared to Sweden. And I didn't have that clarity until after a while. I started piecing together some of the things that were different. And it was one of those things where I put together a talk about it. It's like, oh, that's actually the high order bit in all this, right? And the example
give some examples. Yeah, give some examples.
So the example that I used was like when I moved over to the US, starting a new company, there's like so many different service providers that I had to sign up. And first of all, there were more service providers than in Sweden for some reason. But that wasn't the big delta. The big delta was like how I engaged with them. If I wanted someone to do like a new logo the first logo for my new company, right, here in Sweden, I would meet someone, most likely through the graph, right, through the network, right, but in some way, shape, and form. I would meet them. We would talk about it. We would shake hands. They would then go off, work for like a week or two or something, send me some examples. We would iterate a couple of times, approved, right? And then I'm happy. They send me an invoice. 30 days later or 60 days later, I pay the invoice and off we go. Sweden experience. US experience. I go there. I meet someone, very pleasant, good conversations, high quality, all that kind of good stuff. We agree to work together. Here comes pages and pages of legalese, right? To be read, I have to like get a lawyer to like read through and then I have to sign it and initial every page, like this is pre-DocuSign days, like whatever, right? And then sign, then I have to pay. Like I have to swipe my credit card and pay, and only when they got the money in the account is when they actually would start working on the logo. So even though in many ways I felt like, yes, the US is optimized for entrepreneurship. I could set up a Delaware corporation this quickly, right? In Sweden, I had to have the equivalent of $10,000 as kind of initial capital, like initial equity into the company. There's none of that. So there's like lower friction there, but this kind of lower trust on a relative basis society added more kind of friction to every transaction and interaction.
This episode is brought to you by Runway. You ever feel like you're the only one who gets your company's numbers? Like, really gets it? Explaining it to other people can feel like a drag. It's unbelievable to me how many founders, their team doesn't understand how the business works. Well, that's where Runway comes in. It's not just for you, it's for your whole team. By integrating with hundreds of tools to pull in your data, having everything in one place makes it much easier for the whole team to understand how their individual decisions impact the overall business. This is how you build metrics you can believe and you can trust. It's all drag and drop, everything updates instantly, you get real-time investor reports, and everyone can play with the model. When people understand the model, they make smarter decisions. If you want to see how Runway can give your team the clarity they need, head to runway.com/Eric for a demo and your first 2 months free.
So let's fast forward a little bit and talk about kind of where the company is. Like, you've been through a lot of growing pains, and obviously, yeah, you're absolutely right. I should definitely never imply that running any kind of business is ever easy, because I know in your case and in every case, it's never easy. But talk about kind of how you got past product market fit, like what the growth stage was like, and some of what were some of the lessons that you learned as you powered through what for a lot of companies is problems they would love to have one day.
Yeah. So how we got through product market fit, I think a lot of that was some combination of being the first customer ourselves, right? So that means a huge part of what you taught me and everyone else was kind of around kind of empathy for that end user. Well, empathy for yourself is a lot easier. In fact, I think that doesn't require empathy, technically speaking, right? So building for yourselves and finding others like you. Open source actually helped a lot there because we got a lot of broad adoption, and this was on mailing lists in the early. So kind of shortcutting those feedback loops kind of very, very early, right, was ultra valuable for us in the early days. I think some of the complexities with our type of product, but also with open source, is that there's actually multiple stages to it, where it's okay, you have to have the adoption product market fit, right? But then you also need to figure out how to monetize. Right. And those are kind of two different things. And you probably remember Cisco as our first Fortune 500 customer. And we fought so hard to get it, had to navigate procurement for the first time in my life. There's all kinds of stuff going on there. But if I you said fast forwards, if I think back more towards kind of the latter part of the story, then lessons learned are much more kind of on the managerial side, right? Which is around, okay, how do you actually scale culture from when it's, it's a kind of sub 50, when it's, centered around role modeling mostly, right? That's how I did it. It's between role modeling and kind of hiring. Those are kind of the two pillars. But at some point you need to start kind of working through many more layers of indirection. And how do you actually institutionalize processes around that? My background, I was a pretty good kind of database kernel developer, right?
Yeah, this is nothing good at scaling culture.
Yeah, exactly, right. And how do you hire fantastic kind of enterprise salespeople that, in many ways, kind of are the antithesis of the culture that you value in engineering, right? And how do you, when you realize that you have to have that in order to build a successful company, how do you merge that to become kind of one culture? So it's much more kind of the people and the process and the management side of things where I think kind of more of the learnings are, much more so than on the PMF side.
I think people who come at those skills naturally are the worst people to learn from, because they don't really know how they do it. They just they have the riz, as the kids say, they have that ability to get people excited. So I actually think I wonder if you'd be willing to share some of your failures and challenges, and because I know you've been through a lot of things where you had to you had to F something up and then figure it out, just you've had that journey. And I feel like those lessons are often both, they're more powerful because you actually have the comparison, but also they're easy for people to learn from, because there's a lot of people who are listening to this right now who are just like you, just like who struggle with those things, just like I remember struggling with that too myself. So share some of those failures and some of the lessons you learned from it.
Yeah, so there's plenty to choose from. Maybe let me pick on, and we can talk about kind of the more businessy aspect, but let me pick on something that I think is close to kind of the theme of this podcast series around kind of culture and mission and purpose. And a real failure, which looked like a success right in the beginning there. One of the things that was very clear to me, I actually made a note of saying that I didn't go into the military. I refused to carry weapons because I didn't I didn't want to do that, but I still wanted to do my civilian service. And just a background, like in Sweden, like you get thrown in jail if you don't, like you have to do it as a man, actually. As a woman, you don't have to. And that they actually changed that, 20 years ago. But when I grew up, that was the case. Like, so you had to do it, right? So one of the things that, as an extension, I care deeply about, and kind of the team, was we have such a horizontal product, right? And it's very much like a hammer, right? Where, like, hey, with a hammer, you can hit someone on the head with, or you can build a house so they have a roof over their head, right? And we really did not want to kind of build a hammer that people could hit people on the head with, right? So selling into the military was something that we really struggled with. At the same time, we had this value around open source, where you're actually not, as someone who's on FSF-legal would know, like, you're actually not allowed to constrain kind of any of the use cases, or you are no longer kind of defined as open source, right? And we didn't want to do that either, right? So this is like a big conundrum for us, and became very evident in the early days when we were offered to be on something that's called the GSA schedule. And for those of you, like, basically it's a way of making procurement inside of the US federal government much more easy and scalable, and less kind of frictionful.
Easier for the different agencies to adopt your product.
Exactly, right? And that was like such a huge potential thing for us, because you can imagine the types of use cases for a database that is fantastic at managing lots of data, figuring out how things are related. Like, there's tons of use cases on the civilian side and on the military side, right? But if we were in the GSA schedule, we could not say no to any projects. So then at that point, we would just have to say yes to everything, right? And so we were struggling with this, and our revenues at the time were about 4 cents, or something like that. I mean, it was like super early days, so it would have been very, very meaningful for us. But in the end, we felt like, no, we cannot. This is not who we are. It was so kind of the antithesis of who we are, right? So we ended up saying, no, we're just not going to do it, right? Felt good about ourselves. Felt terrible when we saw kind of the ARR forecast and kind of the revenue and all of that kind of stuff, right? Okay, so you asked for a mistake. That sounded like one of the things that you talked about in the early days, success theater. I only talked about, I made myself look really good in that story, right?
Right.
It turns out, several years later, what's happening? We're now, I don't know, hundreds of people, 400 or 500 people, or something like that. And we now have a federal team which sells into, IRS, and, like, there's an entire kind of tax evasion story there with the Panama Papers and all that kind of stuff, right? So that kind of stuff, right? And we sell selectively into the kind of the military industrial complex. Certainly not everything is bad there. Like, arguably the internet was born out of that, right? So there's like lots of good stuff, right? And I remember interviewing this candidate who was like an SE, focused on selling into the government. This is a guy that I really respected, and what he said is like, hey, just about I'm a mission-driven person. I love doing what I do. This is the most honorable thing I can do with my life, outside of carrying a rifle, like on the wall. And I just remember reacting so strongly to that. That's what he saw as kind of honor and the ethical thing to do. Someone who I deeply respected. And that really started like making me think, like, who are we today? Like, as an organization today, and you talk about how companies are organisms. Yes, we had, like, the early team, myself, had this point of view of like how to think about military applications. But is that truly kind of Neo4j at the time, that entire organism? Is that what we value? Started thinking a lot about that. And then Ukraine happened. And I realized that, you know what? My views on this have been shaped by a very atypical moment in time and place in geography, where when I grew up, I'm born 78, like you are, I remember being taught where the bomb shelters were, like in elementary school, like in case the Soviet Union would kind of attack, right? My sister, who's 6 years younger, does not remember that. So like that happened so quickly in the early 90s, right? And so I just realized that actually Western democratic values, I actually believe that it is right to protect them. And that entire, so as I then kind of thought through that entire thing, the entire point that I felt so righteous and holy about pulling ourselves from the GSA schedule, we've actually kind of turned around and now said that we actually proudly sell into the military. And this comes from me, like who like literally can refuse to carry a weapon and kind of all of that kind of stuff. So I think that was like a big lesson in like, all right, some of the things like with a purpose-driven and a mission-driven company, that evolves and changes over time. And it has to represent kind of it should represent kind of a joint kind of part of all the people at the company and be very authentic to the CEO. But that had become like a mismatch over time.
Look, one of my beliefs, people think I'm so crazy, but I really believe that organizations are alive. They're literally as alive as you or me. They're a super organism, that we are components of them. And it's very hard for founders to come to the realization you came to, where your personal values are not the same as the organization's values. And I wonder if you could talk about your story is really interesting to me, because it's really a story of self-discovery and the evolution of your own sense of morality and ethics. But it's also a story of a mission-driven company, like discovering really what is the mission. And I think really being able to, I think we can, as companies, we can differentiate between, the pursuit of the defense of Western values is really different than the use of weapons in other contexts. I think we can make those calls. They're hard calls, but we can make them. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you've, how do I say this? Let me try that again. When people hear a company has changed its values or that there's been this mission evolution, that's often code, frankly, for investors got involved and sort of hollowing out the soul of the company. I mean, let's just be really real. When you hear that, people hear that story like, founder told me, I had a realization that this ethical stand we were taking before, we're not going to take it anymore. It's like, our minds all go to the exact same place. And we've seen company after company after company, don't be evil and all this. And just like those commitments get lost and the companies start to lose trust. And it's kind of a frankly sad process. So I'm curious, how have you managed that tension where you have this real mission orientation, you have these strong beliefs, but you also have investors, you have these outside stakeholders. The company's now gotten big enough that there's people in the world where their whole net worth is very much tied up in your business success. That creates a gravitational pressure. And for a lot of companies, it's a gravitational pressure that pulls them down into mediocrity. Can you talk a little bit about how you've navigated those tensions?
Yeah. I mean, I guess first, maybe this is like a semantic thing. I don't know, but what I talked about there, I don't see as mission drift, because our mission was help the world to make sense of data. That was this case back when I first met you. That is the case today. This was something layered on top of that. And you could argue that the stance that we took in the early days was actually inconsistent with the mission, because it wasn't help the world minus the military make sense of data, right? So I guess that's the first one. I think the second one to me is, remember when the Netflix culture deck came out, right? It was this amazing PowerPoint, and it just became this lightning rod in Silicon Valley. I think that one of the things that has helped us a lot is that this is technically true, but I mean this on a more conceptual level. Our culture deck is written in Google Slides, not in PowerPoint, right? So we've done a lot of kind of core values refresh, right? And we've tried to do that in kind of an authentic bottom-up way. Not entirely, by the way. It's not an entirely democratic process, but with a lot of buy-in, right? And so we did that maybe 4 or 5 years ago. We were about 200-300 people, right? And we felt that the old articulation of the values, they were stale. They weren't really kind of descriptive of how we actually behaved. I also felt at the time that I need to start being stronger in enforcing these. And I did not feel comfortable enforcing the values without first getting buy-in on the values from the organization at the time, right? So we were, I'm going to make it up, 200 people like back then. And we'd first articulated the core values around maybe 20 or 30 or something like that, right? And I didn't feel, and maybe 190 of them were new. So like, why should I hold you to this thing? Yes, we went through it in the hiring process. Yes, but like, was that a checkbox exercise? Or kind of that insecurity that I had as a CEO. And being able to make that kind of a meta value that we have two meta values. One is like, it's of course in a complete cultish fashion on our on our cups, like we value relationships. We have 6 core values and they're like my children. I love them all equally, but there is a first among peers, which is the first value. We value relationships, and all the other values are derived from that. People believe that we've chosen that value because we built a graph database that is centered around relationships in data. And of course, it's exactly the opposite way around. Like, we are people who value relationships. If you invent a new type of database, like you build one that is centered around relationships. It's like when we built our visualization tool. It's not a generic Tableau visualization. It's a graph visualization tool because that's who we are, right? Like that's how we see the world, right? So that's one kind of meta core value. We value relationship. The other one is this thing with like we write our core values in Google Slides, not in PowerPoint. So I think that has been helpful in terms of just kind of help evolving those core values. Now, out of the 6, 3 are the same as they were back in when we were 10, 20, 30 people, right? So like some of them have remained true, but I don't kind of commit to that they're forever going to be the same. They're going to evolve and adapt as the organization grows.
If your values are changing on a regular basis, how do you know you're not experiencing mission drift? I think that's a really common anxiety that CEOs have.
I don't think I do, right? I think that comes back to, all right, trying to be, actually our 4th value is we value intellectual honesty, right? And try to be like rigorously, ruthlessly, relentlessly, intellectually honest. Look at the data, look at yourself in the mirror. And I have that insecurity right now, right? And I wouldn't say that they constantly change. We've changed them probably around every 4 or 5 years. We've updated them. So it's not that frequent, but I've not figured out a good recipe for kind of identifying kind of that small kind of angular velocity where you start seeing the drift, other than just working really hard at it. Look at the data, look yourself in the mirror, and try to be as true to your authentic self. If you have any tips, I'd love to hear them.
I'll pitch you. Let me pitch you on a concept and see if you like it. Okay. So there's 2 ideas that I've put together that I found really helpful on this problem. And one is that companies today already do a huge amount of work to communicate what their values are, and then to like rank everybody based on how well they have achieved the values. That's usually done in HR and promotions and employee comms and whatever. So I'm a big believer that every company should have a leader's guide. That's literally a book, like some document somewhere that just says for every value, here are the examples and the stories and the lore of times that people enacted that value. And this is a Howard Schultzism. You use that to build the reservoir of trust, he called it. Now, anytime someone makes a decision inside the company, if they sacrifice something selfishly on behalf of themselves or the company in defense of one of the values, that builds up the reservoir of trust. That's like making a deposit in your culture bank. And anytime you do the reverse, it's a withdrawal. And his advice, it's just always make deposits, never make withdrawals. And then it doesn't help to do that unless you tell everybody that you did that. So you need like a library of these stories and issues. I call it the leader's guide. And it's really important to refresh it periodically because if it gets stale, it doesn't seem relevant to them anymore. And I've worked with lots of companies where people are still talking about like what the ghost of Thomas Edison thinks about whatever. It's like, well, that was a really long time ago. Do you have any more, contemporary stories about this happening? You don't have contemporary stories, you get drift automatically. And people
so just make sure I understand this. So then it's like, it's basically looking at the timestamps of that. Hey, when we look into the library and like they're all 4 years old, okay, either we've been shitty at updating the library, like that should be like a warning signal for you at the very least. I love that.
But the other half, the thing I find really interesting is people sometimes say to me, where am I supposed to source all these stories? It seems like a lot of work. But if you think about it, companies, almost every company does an annual review. Every employee is reviewed every year, sometimes multiple times a year in most companies. And somebody like formally writes something up about how well they did. In fact, a lot of companies use a values matrix to see like, to give examples. And in a lot of companies, the communication of the values and the evaluation of employees are handled by two separate people, two separate departments. So I call it the two-way review, where we integrate this together and say, look, you're going to source all these stories. You do it every year. Don't throw them away at the end. Instead, find the best stories and reintegrate them into the leader's guide. If you do that every year, you automatically keep it fresh. And when you give people the matrix that examines, how well you did at each thing, you usually give an example. There's almost always an example for like, here's how that thing was done well. You have these, you use the examples from the leader's guide in the evaluation process, so people are judging their behavior against that. If you do that continuously, you keep it up to date. And the reason that I like this structure is that eventually you'll find yourself in a situation where it's not covered. There's like no chapter for this. Like something genuinely new happens. So you're like, oh my God, no one knows what to do in this situation. And most companies, that's like, hide it, bury it, like make it go away, right? It's just like no good. But that's actually the most valuable information you get is like now something new has happened. And the GSA example is so perfect, where it's like, we've made that. It probably, that could have been a story in your leader's guide where like, we know that this is the right thing and we believe in nonviolence as a value and we will never do this. And then you get into a situation where it's like, this is actually getting in the way of us accomplishing something. And so instead of being like waiting until it kind of feels weird, you actually have like a formal process. Like, a thing came up where we need to consider and like have a process for deciding and thinking about, does this mean they were wrong or we were wrong? Who was wrong here? So this didn't like our values didn't work in this situation. What happened?
The initial premises as spelled out in here, explicitly or implicitly, we don't even know if we agree with those premises anymore. Right. And so
sometimes that
therefore,
happens.
like the downstream kind of consequences of that could be pretty significant.
Yeah. And so if you make that like a regular part of your company's HR system, then it's not a crisis. And to me, it's all about trust. That's why I started with the reservoir of trust. Whenever a company changes its values, whenever it makes an adjustment to the mission, any kind of pivot, people always want to know, are you like, and the CEO gets on, now these days we do it on Zoom often. The CEO is on Zoom and like, hey, we've made this decision to do that. And everyone's sitting there being like, is this a hostage video? Or is that what he really thinks, right? Like, is there an investor right off screen with a gun being like, you better say that you think this is in alignment with it? And it's very difficult to build trust when people don't know if you're being authentic to it. And I think your point from way earlier in the conversation that transparency is what breeds the trust. Here, if we run this process, it can actually become part of the lore of the company that we found this situation, we didn't know what to do. And we made this determination. Here's all the people that weighed in, and here's all the different ideas about it. And then the other thing that sometimes happens, I think this is also really important, is that one thing that mission drift happens is when the company gets big enough that all of a sudden there's like a lot of hypocrisy going on. Like someone is told to do something, and instead of just having a conversation about it, they start to be like, oh, I see. I'm in a place where they want me to do one thing, but say I did a different thing. Like, yes, sir. So like that kind of stuff is just very natural. We get bigger. Humans are bad at this kind of stuff. Communication is hard. So we get, so sometimes what has to happen is we get into one of these situations and you have to investigate to find out, well, what actually happened? People will be like, our values didn't work here. And it's like, well, is that really what happened? Or actually they did, they would have worked except, or you get into it. So by making that part of your regular process, it ceases to be like an exceptional emergency thing and more of a routine thing. That's my pitch to you. What do you say?
I love it. I think it's fantastic. I think as with everything else, then like the human judgment call, like I think any process like this can only kind of nudge you and serve up the data and the circumstantial. And then what you do with it is what truly matters. But I love that as a way of as a system, right? That should trigger in these types of situations.
Yeah.
Good.
I'm glad you like it. I've been thinking about it a lot, so I'm glad to have somebody to pitch it to. And I think, it doesn't. It's one of these systems that doesn't really make sense if you don't already have a kind of a purpose, like a deeper purpose that the company is committed to, and you haven't already made a commitment to try to be trustworthy as a management philosophy. So I spend so much time with people in the those more basic questions. I don't get to get into these advanced topics as often. You guys are one of my favorite examples of a company that was doing something really awesome. And, now we're in the midst of this AI revolution, and generative AI is taking on, taking over so many parts of the world. And there's certain companies where it's like it's as if you had a time machine. It could have gone back and told yourself, look, if you want to be ready for generative AI, this would be the kind of thing that would be extremely useful to have spent 10 or 15 years working on in advance. And now it's like by the time you get the memo about it, it's too late. And people scrambling to create database products and stuff like for AI. And I always laugh, like somebody who's working on this for a really long time. So first of all, talk about what it's been like to have AI like sweep through the world and become the hottest thing on the planet, and how that's been for you. And then I'd like to just really would like to talk a little bit about the implications of AI, for your business, but also what for people who are trying to use AI in their own business, like what can they learn from the things that you've discovered so far?
Yeah. So this has been a massive thing for us here. And, just at a high level, like a graph database, people talk about it as a knowledge graph as well. It's just a really powerful structure to articulate information in a way that makes sense. It makes it easy to make sense of that information, coming back to our mission of helping the world to make sense of data, right? And it turns out that it makes it easy for human beings to understand if it's structured in this really visual, connected way. It also makes it very easy for machines to understand it. And it can be this amazing bridge between kind of large language models and internal knowledge that you have at your organization, right? Which on some level is kind of the killer use case for LLMs or Gen AI inside of the enterprises. Give these tools access to the internal information. So huge simplification, tons more details we can talk about kind of under that. But maybe kind of on the inside of what this was like kind of for me and for us, this was a little bit of a challenging situation, honestly, because I feel like, I don't even know if this is the right way to think about it, but like it was a conflict between my CEO hat and my founder hat. And what I mean by that is that when this all happened, we had launched a graph data science product, which is a product that sits on top of our database that is targeted data scientists years or like 4 or 5 years ago, which is really successful. People loved it, right? And so we kind of dipped our toes into the world of data science and AI a little bit, right? But when ChatGPT happened, kind of that moment for most of the world, right? And, you had Reid Hoffman on, like he obviously saw it kind of way earlier. But for those of us who didn't, it was really that kind of November of 2022. Well, these were very tough years. This is just as kind of the industry got off the whatever 10, 12 year of the Zert era,
Sure,
and the crash of
terrible
readjusting. Exactly, right? And how many of your CEO friends said, I'm in wartime mode, right? Like probably every single one of them, right?
I feel
myself included.
A few of those phone calls. I remember it well.
Yeah, right. And like in many ways, what people, when they say kind of I'm in wartime mode, what it means is that I am forced to think short term, make brutal kind of trade-offs, and be in a very kind of operational mode. That's where I was. Very, very operational. I actually ran sales in that quarter. Like I owned the number, like I was the CRO for the company, which is no one's like, that is not my favorite thing in the world. It is not the favorite thing in the world for the company as well. I'll tell you that I'm not a great sales leader, right? And when this happened, and so then rolling kind of into 2023, I was still very much kind of in that highly operational mode. At the same time, all of my instincts and some of the kind of early people was like, this can be amazing for us. This could be this discontinuous curve in the market that we've been waiting for. And in one of the board meetings, my CFO said, like, hey, one could wait their entire career for a moment like this to happen. And I stopped and like, no, I did wait my entire career for this. It's like, that's not, I'm not so hypothetical. That's literally what's happening right to us. But it requires this kind of spike in innovation. in figuring out how do we fit in this new ecosystem, and in a world that was moving faster than anything I've ever seen in my life, where every week, every day,
It was,
things.
that time was just unbelievable. Like the new paper coming out every day with incredible new capabilities. It was
exactly
fun.
invalidating absolute truths from last week. Which no, it was just. And
now
at the
it's only
same
happening
time,
like once a week, so it's kind of slowed down.
yeah, I know it's so slow, right? Exactly, and I really felt like, okay, I have an organization that is optimized for doing kind of the old, and I don't mean the old as in we're moving away from it, but our existing multi-$100 million business selling into most of the Fortune 500, right? But that one was under pressure with sales cycles extending, macro, soft landing, reset, remember that was kind of the talk at the time, right? And then the ability for us as an organization to then focus on this bet, this hunch that this could be kind of huge for us, that was a big struggle for me personally. And I actually had to hands-on kind of take time off of my calendar, just block out and be very kind of and that's why I said in the founder hat versus the CEO, I'd be very kind of hands-on technological, right? And see what can we do to truly kind of fit into this. So that was a little bit when you asked how have we perceived it, it's led to a fantastic outcome right now, but it's very painful when it happened.
It's such a great long-term, short-term story. One of the things I've counseled a lot of companies through downturns and crises and stock market crashes and stuff. I've been at this a little while now. And one of the things I think is really interesting is it always seems to happen that way, that the really critical opportunity for investment comes up when at the time you're under the most pressure to cut costs. I don't know why. I think it's because during the good times, everyone's investing in lots of stuff, but it's you invest. A lot of these investments really aren't. They're just spending money, and so investors kind of overreact and they put on this pressure. One of the things I've noticed is that people lose sight of the fact that these cycles are cyclical. It sounds like such a dumb thing to say. We call it a business cycle because what goes down comes up and vice versa. This happens. It's not predictable, in the specifics, but at a macro level, we know it will happen. And companies that during the lean time, the difficult times, cut, and start to squeeze and exploit and really get away from their fundamental values. When the tide turns, the whole company takes away from that this lesson. A new part of the company lore is that the way we saved ourselves was by abandoning the things that made us successful before, and this new culture takes root. And the companies, a lot of times, the company, to be honest, a lot of times what you do during those years doesn't, as long as you stay alive, it doesn't really matter that much. Things turn. So the sales cycles go down again, and all of a sudden you look like a genius, whatever you were doing. So the companies that actually found a way to invest, they come roaring back. And not only is that great for the business, it becomes a really important part of the lore. And the one that you described there, that's the most classic such tension, where it's the world has changed and a new business opportunity has been created. And people say we don't have the time and attention for that. We can't afford it. We can't do this. I can only imagine the arguments you were getting with people who are stressed, trying to make the quarter, the month, the week, the day. This seems like such a distraction. But again, forgetting the fundamental lesson that if disruption is going to happen, the choice is, you can't be I don't want it to happen. It's just, are we going to be the ones to do it, or is someone going to do it to us? And so talk a little bit about the resistance that you faced and frankly, how you overcame it.
Yeah, so maybe a little bit more context. Simultaneously with kind of the shift in macro, we were also going through another transformation, which is around the shift to the cloud. So obviously, in this conversation, we've talked about, late 2000s era, early 2010s, right? So we grew up as an on-prem or a self-managed open source product that you download, right? And that is obviously not what we look like today. Today, we're a cloud service primarily, right? But that did not happen overnight. That's actually a very tough journey, which requires a huge amount of investment. It's existential in nature, right? Because if you're not a cloud service, you're not going to be, in reality, a reasonable choice for any customer in the future, right? So this was going on at the same time, right? Sucking a lot of the oxygen in the room, and then there's macro pressure, and then this new thing kind of with AI. I think there were two things that made it a little bit easier than kind of the story that you painted. One is specifically AI in 2023, there's a lot of air cover to invest in, right? Like if there's one thing in 2023 you could actually get money for, it was for just branded AI. And I'm sure there's a ton of AI washing going on and stuff like that, but kind of top to bottom, kind of investors, boards, CEOs, CFOs were willing to invest in AI. So I think that was one thing that helped. I think the other piece was, and you know this better than anyone, but just the power of really small, fast-moving teams, right? Like, yes, on our kind of normal product, it's a database, right? So it can never go down, can never lose data. You know, again, we have all these amazing services relying on us, right? And so there's all kinds of process and procedures, and there's an army building that out, right? But this AI world, much, much more fast moving, much more experimental, right? And so the power, so what we ended up doing is that we pulled away just a tiger team or a small team, a handful of people. It was 5 people. They had to be more than 80% of their time had to be focused on this. And then I spent a huge amount of time with them. And so we got kind of that CEO authority or CEO kind of blessing. And that ended up being kind of the thing that unlocked, okay, here's actually a story that makes sense. This also, if we switch to kind of the market side or the technical side, this also coincided with the rise of RAG or retrieval augmented generation as an architecture for letting LLMs get access to information that they're not trained on, which in the first half of 2023, most of the answer to that was fine-tuning, right? Where we don't have as much of a story to play, but with RAG, the database is at the core and center of all of that. So those things came together and it clicked. And once we found that, it became a lot easier to start then investing behind it.
So I want to kind of, as we close the conversation, maybe think a little bit about the future. And I think it's really important for people who are listening to this to understand retrieval. It's one of the most important topics in AI, and yet one of the most misunderstood things people are running into business. And it's obscured by the fact that most people's experience of the new AI, it comes in the form of things like ChatGPT. And the fact that there's retrieval going on is a little bit hidden from the end user. It's not as obvious what's happening. And so it actually makes it very unclear what's going on. So maybe let's just start with, because we have a very technical audience for this show, but we also have a lot of non-technical folks. So just give us a level set, like what is retrieval and why is it important?
Yeah. So at the highest level, IR or information retrieval is kind of academic speak. If you go to the computer science departments, it's academic speaks for really two different things. One is some version of search, which has techniques like inverted index and BM25 and those kind of terms, but it's basically Google search, right? But like on a computer science level, like in the more technical aspects of that, right? That's kind of one. The other one is databases, right? So that is what IR is, or information retrieval. The reason why it's really central in the world of AI is kind of what we've been circling around here for a while when we talked about the technology, which is the LLMs are only trained on data up until the time when you stop training them, right?
And people don't realize this. They are complete amnesiacs. They don't remember anything that you told them a second ago. Every question you ask is a brand new question as far as it's concerned. And it does not learn from its interactions with the end user. So it has to be augmented with what we call context of what the F is going on in this conversation, including who are you again? And what was your question? And if you look at how ChatGPT is implemented, like the model has to actually be told in real time while you're sitting there what it told you the last question you asked it, like so that it can continue the conversation from before. It's like, we watched the movie Memento, if you remember that, the guy like scrawling things on his physical body. Like that's what it's like. It cannot remember anything unless it's in the context window.
And not just that, but it's also trained on basically in 99% of the situation today, it's trained on just public information, right? It's trained on Wikipedia and Common Crawl and YouTube comments and kind of God save us all.
And every tweet that's ever been written. Yeah, exactly.
That kind of stuff, right? And really what you want to do is kind of augment that with your own knowledge, right? And that is where this architecture of RAG or retrieval augmented generation comes in. And you said it really well, Eric. Like if you if you're on ChatGPT, like we all know how we can say, hey, dear ChatGPT, I just got a long email. Can you summarize it for me? Here's the email, : and then you copy paste like this long email in, right? Basically, what we want to be able to do is write systems in the, like applications in the enterprise that is copy pasting kind of internal information from the enterprise into the LLM, right? And so the classic use case, and we can all talk about what use cases actually work today with Gen AI and all that kind of stuff, but the classic use case is always customer support, right? So imagine that you're a company and you have kind of 10 years or 20 years or 30 years of being able to answer customer support calls. And you have actual human being customer support reps. They answer. How do they answer? By looking in some knowledge base with some knowledge articles. And when they answer something new, they write it down and contribute to the knowledge base, right? So you have decades of that stored somewhere in your big company, right? Now what you want to do is, okay, I want an LLM to answer that. So then the game becomes, all right, when I'm copy pasting this information out of my existing knowledge base into the LLM, what are the top, let's call it 5 to 10 documents that I'm going to pass on to it? Because I can't send all of them, because that's too long, takes too long time, probably too costly, as well as all kinds of technical inhibitors.
You give it non-relevant information in the context, it can't tell which is the question and which is the context anymore.
Exactly. And then there's all kinds of problems with like these long context windows where they have the U-shaped recall. So all kinds of problems with that. So basically what the game ends up being is, okay, when Eric has problem with his, I'm going to make up the example here. We're like a Wi-Fi manufacturer, and Eric has problem with his Wi-Fi, and he logs on to the kind of customer support desk. Normally, Eric would talk to an agent and say, they're flashing yellow and my connection gets dropped intermittently or something like that, right? Now you're going to type it.
How did you know?
Yeah,
I just had that conversation.
Yeah, I'm sure. Exactly, right.
We all had that conversation. Yeah.
Right. And now you're going to type that instead, right, to like a Gen AI backed bot, right? And so then you got to find what are the top 5 to 10 documents in your support article knowledge base of 10,000 or 50,000 documents, right? What are the top 5 to 10 that you pass on to the LLM and say, please answer Eric's question based on the content in these, right? So that all of a sudden is an IR problem. It's a retrieval problem, right? Going from the question that Eric typed in to which of the top kind of 10, right? And of course, like where we come into all this as kind of the graph people is that there is a massive case study of doing retrieval, that the biggest one that humanity has ever done, which is called the web, right? And the web, again, dating, as we've talked a lot about kind of old times in this conversation, but like there were actually search engines before Google. And I know the millennials in here were going to be like shocked at that, but they were like Lycus and Excite and Alta Vista and that kind of stuff. And for those of us who were kind of around in the early days of the internet, you would search for something, right? And initially the problem was you couldn't find it because the content literally wasn't available on the internet, right? Then after a while, we got the Alta Vista effect. And what was the Alta Vista effect? It was that no matter what I searched for, I got like 1 million hits, but none of them were relevant. Or at least like the first many, many pages that I looked through weren't relevant. The reason that Google today is one of the most valuable companies on the planet is that they solved that problem. They solved that problem by identifying the top 10 blue links, like the 10 most relevant documents for you, which, as you can hear, is eerily similar to the problem facing Gen AI in the enterprise right now. How can I find the top 10 most relevant documents to pass on to the LLM, right? Google solved that with a graph algorithm called PageRank, which is let's take all the search results and then let's rank them based on how they're linked to each other, right? And that is exactly what we then do in this world of AI, which is called then RAG, or specifically Graph RAG, which is one of the most popular modern use cases for Neo4j today.
Someone just showed me, there's a bunch of viral videos going around on TikTok where people ask ChatGPT how many R's are in the word strawberry, and right. It doesn't know. And the reason it doesn't know is actually for a really interesting reason, which is that the AI does never actually see the word strawberry. the word is translated into what we call vector space. It's turned into a number that represents that concept, and then it's passed in the context to the AI to answer the question. And it's seen a lot of people say a lot of things about strawberries over the years, but apparently this one question is not enough in the training data that it does not know to say that correctly, because of course it doesn't know that you used the word strawberry. There's a lot of words you might have used. And so what's really fascinating about that is when people do retrieval with this, the way it's mostly done today is we take all the data that we have, we put it all into vector space, and we find the documents that are nearest in the vector space to the thing that we are asking, which is like so eerily similar to how we used to do keyword search for web results. That people, again, may not remember this era, but there was a time when if the literal phrase you were searching for did not appear in the target document, then it would not be returned to you as a result, which, it's like next time you use Google, actually pay attention to this and see how often the literal thing you want to know, like, does it actually say that exact phrase? It almost always doesn't. And of course, because a PageRank and other things found a way around this problem. But we're still doing that for retrieval. We're just naively grabbing whichever word. Now, we're not using keyword matching. We're using concept matching. So we're like at a higher level. But there's like this implicit amount of intelligence. There's like a whole other AI system that is just trying to figure out which documents are relevant. And we're using extremely primitive tools to load up the context window with like fragments of documents that seem like they might be related. And then we get mad at the AI system when it hallucinates. It doesn't know the answer. And it's like, I really feel like a big part in the enterprise, and we'll link to we're doing this whole lean AI playbook, and we'll talk more about that another time, but just a big part of the reason why so many enterprise deployments of AI today are just, they make a great demo, but they're not useful in practice, is because the retrieval's not working. And so this genius level AI, it has so much information, but it doesn't know what the one thing the customer wants to know. It doesn't know that fact. In fact, is not on the internet, is not available on Wikipedia. No one has ever tweeted about it, right? But it is sitting in your customer service database. And if you could just pull that one correct fact into the context window and not surround it with too much extraneous context, it could give a perfect answer. And
it's going to give the right answer.
They're falling down on this just very, very basic thing. And I think because people doing these projects are often not technical enough to understand how the pieces work together, they're not getting the results that they expect.
I think that's spot on. I think the other piece of this, maybe to tie kind of our stories together here, right? Like you talked about kind of vector space and kind of distance calculation. And if you think about like an example that I use is if you have like an apple and a tennis ball, and you look inside a vector space, so for an LLM or this thing called a vector database, right? It's probably going to say that they're pretty close to each other, like an apple and a tennis ball, like a green apple maybe even, right? But you don't know why. You just know that there's some distance. But is it because of the greenness of the thing? Is it because of the roundness of the thing? Like, you don't know. You just know that it's 0.7 distance, which is way closer than anything else. That's all that you know. In graph space, you know that an apple is a fruit and a ball is an object. You know exactly why they're related. An apple and orange is related because they're fruits, right? Mm-hmm. That visibility, that literal connection, that transparency, right, leads to explainable decisions, right? Which, coming back from kind of full circle in this conversation, is what gives us trust in the AI system, right? That transparent way of looking at the world compared to the opaque kind of nature of the LLM and the vector space is what gives an AI system kind of trust if you have the more explicit one, right? So that's a huge part of what I think is going to be important for the future of AI.
That is a wonderful full circle moment to end on. I just think the connection between transparency and trust, like it's so holistic. It is true at this technical level. It's true at the product level. And of course, as we've been talking about, it's true at the company building level. So we will link to, I know you have a lot of resources that you guys have published on how to do this kind of retrieval correctly, and thoughts on the future of AI. We'll link to that in the show notes. And Emil, I just wanted to say thanks for taking the time. Thanks, by the way, for being a sponsor of season 1 of the show. Really appreciate your support. It's been phenomenal. I hope you've enjoyed it. And
loved it.
I look forward to many, many years of collaborations in the future. Appreciate you taking the time.
You've been listening to The Eric Ries Show. The Eric Ries Show is produced by Jordan Bornstein and Kiki Garthwaite. Research by Tom White and Melanie Rehack. Visual design by Reform Collective. Title theme by DB Music. I'm your host, Eric Ries. Thanks for listening and watching. See you next time.